Welcome to this evening's event. The perspectives, this lecture is part of a series called the Perspectives on Economic Liberty series. It's hosted by the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty, which is part of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. The Perspectives lecture series emerges from the center's mission, which is to evaluate the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. Our goal is to advance research that affects liberty-enhancing policy, increases public and academic awareness of the history and philosophy of economic liberty, and leads to more voluntary bottom-up governance. Our speaker today is Tim Sandefur, recently named the Barry Goldwater Chair in American Institutions at ASU for 2023 to 2024. The Goldwater Chair was established in 1977 in conjunction with the Goldwater family to honor Senator Goldwater's service to Arizona and the United States. The intention is for the chair to be given to scholars who distinguish themselves in the field of political science, history, economics, law, public policy, and who uphold the principles of Americanism, individual freedom, and the free enterprise system. Tim will hold the chair for this academic year. For both graduate students and those in the general public who are interested, Tim will be teaching a Tuesday evening graduate seminar in the spring 2024 semester entitled The American Dream, Economic Liberty as an American Institution. The course will focus on the social, cultural, and legal influence of economic freedom in America. That course is part of the courses being offered through the School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, and you can contact their staff to enroll in that course. Now, about our speaker. Tim Sandefur serves as a vice president at the Goldwater Institute, overseeing its legal scholarship programs as well as litigating in defense of constitutional rights in state and federal courts. He has authored over 50 scholarly articles and 8 books on a variety of legal and historical topics, including the topic of this afternoon's presentation. And now for Tim's topic. His book, Freedom's Furies, How Isabel Paterson, Rose Wilder Lane, and Ayn Rand Found Liberty in an Age of Darkness, is the subject of the lecture. Tim's book is not so much a biography of the 3 libertarian thinkers as it is about how their lives and ideas influenced their times, primarily between the early 1920s and the 1960s. Wilder Lane's mother was, of course, Laura Ingalls Wilder, who, without her daughter's editorial hand, may not have succeeded making the Little House on the Prairie series successful. But there is much more to tell about Rose as a journalist, novelist, and the author of The Discovery of Freedom. Canadian-born Isabel Paterson wrote the libertarian treatise God of the Machine, published during World War II, which was proclaimed the document that could literally save the world by Ayn Rand. Rand was the last of the 3 women chronologically, but remains the best known. Rand wrote The Fountainhead, published in 1943, and to bring us full circle to this afternoon, Rand endorsed Barry Goldwater in his 1964 presidential campaign. Join me in welcoming Tim to the ASU campus.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and my mic's on.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's a real honor to be here. I brought along copies of the book. For those of you who don't have any, you can have those. And if you already paid for a copy, well, all I can say is I'd be happy to sign your copy for free. In the last week of November 1943, the journalist and author Isabel Paterson had a very unusual appointment. She found herself having lunch with former President Herbert Hoover at his office at the Waldorf Astoria in Manhattan. And this was a very awkward meeting for Patterson because she despised Hoover. She thought his policies as president between 1929 and 1933 had been senseless and counterproductive, and that his books and speeches were moronic. Dreary nothings, she called them. No ideas, few facts, no form, no writing. Patterson had agreed to meet with Hoover, however, after he expressed admiration for her book, The God of the Machine, a penetrating study of economics and the sociology of liberty. And her friend, Rose Wilder Lane, had just published her book, The Discovery of Freedom, and Ayn Rand, who had just published her novel, The Fountainhead. They both hoped that the former president might help generate publicity for Patterson's book. In fact, Lane had probably arranged that meeting because she had known Hoover for more than 2 decades by that time. She wrote a biography of him in 1920 when he was first considering running for president, and she corresponded with him long afterwards. But as Patterson later reported to her protege Ayn Rand, the lunch did not go well. "I can hardly remember anything he said," she wrote, because he didn't say much in substance. The former president had insisted on leaving the door open throughout lunch, quote, "so the 2 girl secretaries could doubtless preserve his virtue if it came to the worst," end quote. He had poor table manners, Patterson said, and she said, he really is fat. But worst of all, Hoover was a dope. He seemed to grasp none of the ideas in her book and instead muddled them with his own pseudo-intellectualism. The climax of the meeting came when Patterson challenged him on a point that had bothered her all her life. Why did the leaders of businesses not speak out in their own defense when the Franklin Roosevelt administration burdened them with regulations and taxations and antitrust lawsuits and other forms of persecution? In fact, the nation's business leaders seemed all too eager to submit themselves to the New Deal's regimentation and control and to subsidize socialist intellectuals, as Nelson Rockefeller was subsidizing Diego Rivera, and Vincent Astor was underwriting the new masses. Why, Patterson demanded to know, did the industrialists refuse to speak out in defense of liberty? "He told me what they all tell me," Patterson told Rand. "They are far too busy to think. They have no time or opportunities to do so. You see how it is. They have what is called a good education, and they make money, and they have 2 or 6 secretaries and meals sent up to them, and they are large, able-bodied men, so it's impossible for them to think. Whereas you and I, with the extraordinary advantages we possess, being women, with a living to earn as best we can, and no backing, and the dishes to wash, and with aforesaid prominent men cutting our throats by endowing every triple asterisk pink in the country, and supporting the same on all the periodicals, it's obvious that we can very well do all the thinking, is it not? Why, certainly. You and I ought to burst into loud sobs over the unfortunate destiny of those men who had no chance at all to think." Typical Patterson. As silly as Hoover's answers may have been, however, the conversation does point up an interesting question about American political thought in the middle of the 20th century. Why did it seem that the cause of individualism, by which I mean not only economic laissez-faire, but the whole cultural and philosophical cause of the priority of the individual over the collective, why was it primarily led by women? There certainly were important male defenders of individual liberty during the New Deal era, for example, H.L. Mencken. But these 3 women, Isabel Paterson, Rose Wilder Lane, and Ayn Rand, made contributions to the cause of individualism out of all proportion to women's cultural status in America at the time. That was one of the questions that I set out to answer in Freedom's Furies. And although I can't claim to have a definitive answer, I did arrive at one conclusion, which is that each of these women had a different answer to the question, because just as there are different varieties of feminism today, so there are different varieties of libertarian feminism. None of these 3 women would have called themselves a feminist in the contemporary sense. But all 3 were feminist pioneers, and their experiences flavored their own conceptions of individual freedom. I use the word pioneer advisedly, because at least in Isabel Paterson and Rose Wilder Lane's cases, that was literally true. Both were born in 1886 on the American frontier. Patterson on a small island on the Great Lakes, and Lane in what was then Dakota Territory. Patterson grew up in Michigan and Utah and could vividly remember witnessing Blackfoot Indian ceremonies and the construction of the railroads across the Western Plains. She saw her first light bulb at the age of 16. A year later, the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. And a decade after that, she herself set what was then the world altitude record as a passenger in a rickety airplane, 5,300 feet. The airplane came to symbolize for her the America she had known as a young woman, optimistic, bombastic, heedless, and promising. A world for the taking by those who were bold enough to try. And one of those who was bold enough to try was the sculptor Gutzon Borglum. He's best remembered today for carving Mount Rushmore. Patterson became his secretary in about 1920, and for the rest of her life, she spoke admiringly about his brash personality. She was working for him when he was hired to carve a monument to the Confederate generals on Stone Mountain in Georgia. It turned out to be a miserable experience, with government bureaucrats and other busybodies constantly harassing him about the project. And at last, Borglum became so angry that he hacked apart the plaster models and threw them from the top of the mountain. The project was finished by a different artist. As Patterson said years later, she grew up at a time where men were men. And in fact, that was a persistent theme throughout her work, beginning with her breakout bestseller, Never Ask the End, and continuing in the column that she wrote every week between 1924 and 1949. Patterson's writing sounded a constant theme of loss, of the disappearance of the qualities that she considered essential to American masculinity: entrepreneurialism, bravado, and pluck. With the advent of the Depression and the New Deal, it seemed to her that the American character had inverted itself, and that American men in particular had become cowards and compromisers. There isn't a man left in the country, she told a friend in 1933. They all want to be saved and have their noses wiped for them by Mussolini or Roosevelt or somebody. I will say flatly that I think a man may still be a man if he's panhandling in the street, but not if he's in a government camp. The historian Robert McIlvaine has written that the Depression can be seen as having affected a feminization of American society in which the self-centered, aggressive, competitive male ethic of the 1920s was discredited. Patterson would agree, and she did not approve. She thought that the New Deal and other forms of government paternalism weren't just economically misguided, but that they undermined crucial elements of the American character. Economics was never, in her eyes, just a matter of mechanical dollars and cents. It was always a question of virtue. There were effectively two kinds of people, she thought: those whose primary concern was with producing things and accomplishing things, and those whose primary concern was with controlling other human beings. In an article criticizing a book by a socialist writer, she wrote, "He assumes as his setup a self-existent economy of plenty. There is no such thing. That potential plenty depends entirely upon a minority being allowed to function. We do not mean a class, but a certain type of mind. Businessmen and farmers and foremen and housewives, the people who will always somehow get things done, get some practicable result from whatever material is at hand. They are the self-starters. And their particular function is to hold everything together. A business may be so admirably organized that it looks as if it would run itself. But if you take out one or two men who keep it running and put in some bureaucrat who knows all the graphs and charts, the business will go to pieces. And in an effort to regulate everything, those people may easily be eliminated. Bureaucracy smothers them." Now, her student, Ayn Rand, shared her belief in the traditionally masculine virtues of independent self-reliance, but she came from a very different background. Born in Russia in 1905, she was a generation younger than Patterson, whom she met only in 1941. By then, Rand had fled the horrors of the Soviet Union, hoping to make a living in Hollywood. She wanted to write movies and plays and novels that would articulate her individualist vision and stand up against the trends of communism and fascism that began to devour the world during her youth. She never considered herself a feminist, quite the contrary. But among her earliest influences were the plays of Henrik Ibsen, the Norwegian playwright whose 1879 drama A Doll's House seems to have been a favorite of her mother's. At least her sister, Nora, was named after the play's main character. That play, a milestone in early feminism, features a housewife named Nora who illegally borrows money to help her husband without telling him, and then begins doing work on the sly to pay back the debt. And she finds that she rather enjoys the feeling of working for money. Over the course of the play, her husband discovers the deception, and she discovers that he's more afraid of the social humiliation that her acts will provoke than of anything else. It dawns on her that her marriage has been a sham, and that her entire life has been lived on other people's terms. "I have existed merely to perform tricks for you," she tells her husband. "It is your fault that I have made nothing of my life." as she leaves the home, he cries out, "This is how you would neglect your most sacred duties?" To which she replies, "I have other duties, just as sacred, duties to myself." Now that obviously appealed to Rand, but equally important was Ibsen's earlier play, Brand, about an uncompromising priest passionately devoted to his ideals. That play features a character named Agnes who is so drawn to Brand's all-or-nothing idealism that she leaves her fiancé to marry Brand and support his cause. And that idea, that femininity consists of looking up to male virtue, became a consistent theme in Rand's writings. She by no means believed that women were inferior figures or anything less than individuals, and she certainly did not believe that a woman's place is in the home. The hero of her novel Atlas Shrugged is a woman who runs a railroad. But Rand longed for the feeling of admiring a hero and was horrified to find that the America she had immigrated to appeared to be turning away from such things. Even before the bureaucracy and regimentation of the New Deal, the country was infested by a spirit of conformity and timidity that was best captured by another writer that Rand admired, Sinclair Lewis. In 1920, Lewis published his novel, Main Street. Has anybody in here read Main Street? One person? Two people? Main Street must be the most influential novel in America after Huckleberry Finn, and also the most boring. It's colossally dull. And the reason why is because the book is about being bored. That's the thesis of the book, is that American bourgeois society is crushingly dull. Where previous writers, such as Mark Twain, had seen the American small town as quirky and cheerful, Lewis portrayed it as a suffocating swamp that obliterated every element of individuality. American life, Lewis declared, was, quote, contentment, the contentment of the quiet dead who are scornful of the living for their restless walking. It is negation canonized as the one positive virtue. It is the prohibition of happiness. It is slavery self-sought and self-defended. It is dullness made God. Notably, Lewis's main character in that novel is not a man, but a woman, Carol Kennicott, who starts out dreaming of a life of significance and meaning, only to have all of her idealism smothered by her spiritless neighbors and her uncultured husband. At one point, she tries to organize a community theater group, but becomes frustrated that nobody takes it seriously. They just want to have fun. "I wonder if you can understand the fun of making a beautiful thing," she pleads with them, "the pride and satisfaction of it, and the holiness." Well, Carol's sense of ennui would be echoed in the character of Dominique in Rand's novel, The Fountainhead, a woman whose intense idealism has been so whittled away that she tries not to believe in anything anymore. Rand's individualism was fueled, at least in part, by a longing for the holiness of making beautiful things, a longing that was stifled first by the consumerism depicted in Main Street, and then by government bureaucracies and controls imposed by the New Deal. But of the three, it was Rose Wilder Lane who most directly addressed the relationship of individualism and femininity. Like Patterson, she had grown up on the Prairie. In fact, she and her mother, Laura Ingalls Wilder, co-authored the Little House on the Prairie novels that would, probably more than anything else, romanticize the idea of living on the frontier. But the reality is that Rose hated it so much that she moved to Albania to get away from it, about as far as you can get before you start coming back. She wanted to be a writer and traveler, and she spent most of her life either on the move or gnashing her teeth at being forced to stay still. As a young woman, Lane became a socialist, largely because socialism promised to break down the sexist cultural rules that barred women from avocations like journalism. In 1920, after finishing her Herbert Hoover biography, she went to Paris to live the life of a lost generation expatriate. And while she was there, she probably became lovers with, of all people, Dorothy Thompson, who would afterwards marry Sinclair Lewis. Thompson was a progressive idealist who made her name campaigning for women's suffrage, which became law in 1920. But while Lane fell in love with Thompson, Thompson was more devoted to her career and went on to become the first woman to head a major American news bureau. She and Lane left Paris in opposite directions a few weeks after their affair began. Thompson went to Germany, where she would be expelled in 1934 for her critical reporting about Hitler, and Lane to Eastern Europe to visit Albania, Armenia, and Georgia. She was there when the Soviet Union was proclaimed, and she witnessed the Bolshevik confiscation and depression In the Balkans, it shocked her out of her socialism. She returned to America in 1925 to rethink her political beliefs. "Remember how we said and felt the sun is rising in Russia?" she asked Thompson 7 years later. "It's a long way from those days to these." Lane began studying the culture and economics of freedom, and in 1936 she published Give Me Liberty, a brilliant little book which anticipated some of the discoveries of the later Austrian economists. For example, she argued almost a decade before Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek would publish their books in the United States that economic order did not need to be established by a central planner but could be instead spontaneous. Lane used a clever analogy to establish her comparison. Contrast the way that a teacher maintains order in a classroom with the way that an audience leaves a theater after a performance. The teacher must always monitor all the students, everything they're doing, and correct them and compel them to act in ways that they would prefer not to. This requires persistent surveillance and control. But when an audience leaves a theater, they're not told where to go or what door to use or what aisles to walk down. They decide for themselves, and yet they manage to reach the sidewalk in safety. In precisely the same way, Lane argued, people can make their own economic decisions and still have social and economic order without being monitored, surveilled, and treated like a bunch of children by a school-marm state. What's more, Lane continued, any effort to regulate economic behavior must inevitably require the regulation of all individual choices entirely. She used soap for an example. If the government tries to dictate how much a business can charge for soap, then that will be affected by how much soap people use, and that will inevitably require the government to dictate how often people can bathe. This might seem like a frivolous argument, but in fact, soap has been a constant preoccupation of totalitarian regimes throughout world history, even dating back to the age of Charles I, when the British monarchy tried to impose a monopoly on soap making, which ended up driving up black markets and becoming a laughingstock around the world. Again, Lane did not think of freedom as primarily an economic phenomenon. It was primarily cultural. It lay in the recognition of each individual's irreducible responsibility. Her slogan for this was, "Freedom is a fact." Just as one person cannot breathe for another, so no other person can be made responsible for another. And government's effort to impose collectivist schemes of servitude was therefore fallacious, because there really is no such thing as political authority. There's just compulsion. As I've said, in 1943, Lane, Patterson, and Rand all published their books. One intriguing thing about these books, by the way, is that their titles are all synonyms. In the 1950s, Lane authorized a republication of her book and changed the title to The Mainspring of Human Progress, which means the same thing as The God of the Machine, which means the same thing as The Fountainhead. What is this creative spark? It's the source of all wealth and innovation. I quoted Patterson earlier objecting to the way that socialists talk about redistributing wealth but never talk about how it's created in the first place. The common theme of these books is the element of individual creativity, its sanctity, and its role as a source of all innovation. They argue that government regimentation and taxation and collectivism were destroying that creativity, and that if trends continued, American progress would collapse as it had already done in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Now, how does this connect to women? I think the answer lies in Lane's emphasis on freedom as responsibility. She even defined freedom as the slavery of self-discipline. Lane and Patterson were 34 years old when the 19th Amendment was adopted. They were 46 when the first woman senator was elected. They were products of the Victorian age. They knew all too well how being protected and helped can serve as a way of depriving people of their freedom. As a girl growing up in the small town atmosphere that Sinclair Lewis had satirized, Lane experienced the debilitating paternalism of the 19th century cult of womanhood, and she fled the country to get away from it. So in the 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt promised Americans that the government would shelter them from risk and pay their debts and feed them when hungry and give them employment and have them and hold them from that day forward in sickness and health for richer and for poorer as long as the citizens promised to love, honor, and obey, it was understandable that women like Patterson, Lane, and Rand would sense the revival of Old Town paternalism. But to me, Lane offered her most interesting insight into the connection between liberty and femininity in her last book, published in 1963, entitled The Woman's Day Book of American Needlework. Lane had been fascinated all of her life by embroidery, crochet, and other sewing techniques, which for centuries had been a monopoly of women. And during her world travels, she came to believe that different national styles reflected the keys to different national characters. She thought it was significant that America has no peasant needlework, no styles or designs that are limited to any particular class, in the way that, for example, it was once illegal in China to embroider a dragon with 5 claws instead of 4 because 5 claws was reserved for the emperor alone. None of that silliness existed in America because as a free country, American women who had practiced needlework had been free to develop their own styles, blending traditional patterns in new and unusual ways. In a passage on crochet, Lane wrote that some future historian someday would look back at American crochet and say, all Americans were rich. There were no American classes because lace was in every home. No lower classes wore their lives away making lace for the superior classes. These Americans were free people, imaginative, creative, and daring. They liked swiftness and change. American lace alone shows you that they were the people who would develop the clipper ships and the ocean steamers and the airplanes. Now, it might seem frivolous to find the character of liberty in needlework, but as Rosika Parker wrote in The Subversive Stitch in 1982, to know the history of embroidery is to know the history of women. Anticipating Parker by 2 decades, Lane was arguing that this art form offered a glimpse of the nature of freedom. Quote, as Americans were the first to know and declare that each human being is a self-governing source of the life energy that controls and changes and creates societies, institutions, and governments, so American women were the first to reverse the old meaning of needlework design. They no longer copied the stiff formal order imposed by enclosed patterns. They made each detail free, self-reliant, complete by itself, not quite like any other, and they let these details create the whole effect, end quote. The ingenuity and creativity of American textile arts, and specifically the fact that these works were homemade by independent people for their own use, revealed the profound degree to which the principles of American freedom had lodged in the soul. By the way, lest I give the impression that Lane became a quilting bee homebody by the time she published this book, 2 years later, at the age of 78, she went to Vietnam as a war correspondent. When Isabel Paterson, Rose Wilder Lane, and Ayn Rand published their books in 1943, books that effectively began the modern libertarian movement, they certainly did not consider themselves as speaking for women specifically. They were individualists who thought that all people, regardless of sex or race or age or whatever, have the same right to live peacefully and pursue happiness in conformity with their own judgment. But their own experiences as women and their conceptions about what it means to be a woman informed their perspectives on individualism and enriched their fiction and their arguments for liberty. Thank you so much. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. No. By the way, if you didn't, I think I brought enough copies of the book for everybody, but if you didn't manage to get one and they're gone, just send me an email or something. I'm happy to send you one.
Thank you very much, Tim, and we look forward to hearing your response to questions from the audience. So the way we typically do this is to raise your hand. I'll find you. It may take a few times to get to you, so be patient. But who would like to kick us off with a question? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I'm just wondering, I assume, are the 3 writers, I assume they've all passed away, right? They're not, okay. And so how do you think they would respond to life as it is now in America with current political?
So the question is, how would these 3 women think of life in America today? So Patterson died in 1961, Lane died in 1968, and Rand died in 1982. As I mentioned, she's about 20 years younger than the other 2, so she lived to 1982. During their later years, they kind of went in different directions. So they were close friends and even collaborators between about 1941. Lane and Patterson knew each other beginning in the 1920s, actually. But the 3 of them worked together beginning in maybe 1941 or so until about 19 49 or so, a little bit later than that maybe. But they gradually drifted apart. There wasn't like a big throwdown. There seems to have been a big throwdown actually between Lane and Patterson. We don't really know what happened because they both destroyed their correspondence with each other. The story goes that Lane had this idea she called a human brotherhood. It was a slogan that seemed to be about equality, but she was trying to do something more than that. She was trying to understand the social mores, the conventions, the habits by which we respect each other's rights. And she thought that there was sort of a natural, instinctual, or natural law drive toward viewing other people as equal with yourself. Patterson thought this was nonsense, and it was a sore spot between them. At one point, finally, during one of their discussions, Lane said something about all men are brothers, and Patterson turned to her and said, "Stalin is no brother of mine." And Lane said to her, "The first person who would say that is Stalin," and they blew up. Now, Patterson appears to have never really trusted Lane, in part because Lane had been a communist. Patterson thought that to have ever been a communist showed such a weakness of character and intellect that that person could never be trusted under any circumstances, even if that person abandoned communism. And so that was a source of friction between the two of them. As for Rand, she and Lane, they only met in person one time. They corresponded for a while, but Rand was so busy working on the movie version of The Fountainhead, which came out in 1949, and with other projects that they just sort of drifted apart. Lane later on denounced Rand and said that she'd never had understood individualism to begin with and so forth. So they had nasty things to say about each other. As for what they would think about the world today, I think in many respects they would be very impressed by the progress we have made. In particular, Lane was, all three of them were outspoken against racism, but Lane was the most so. In fact, she was a columnist for a while for the Pittsburgh Courier, the nation's largest black newspaper. So Lane was quite outspoken in her hostility to racism and especially hostility to anti-Semitism. I think they would all be impressed by the progress with the Brown versus Board and desegregation. All these sorts of things would have impressed them a great deal. But I think they would be very depressed by the state of what Rand termed the mixed economy. The degree to which government control over the economy metastasizes like a cancer, and must do so, because, again, if you control one aspect of the economy, you necessarily must control the next, and the next, and the next. And this logic is inescapable. Of course, Friedrich Hayek would make that the thesis of his book, The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944, the year after these three books came out. So I think they would be quite disappointed. And especially, I think, Patterson. Patterson had this vision. Patterson was the most cynical of the three. And I read you some paragraphs. You see how she was kind of bitter and ironic. You never really find a cynic who isn't an idealist at heart, who's been deeply disappointed in her idealism. And for Patterson, I think she had this vision of America as what she called Atlantis. In fact, that was her term for the America of her youth, was Atlantis. Rand borrowed this and uses that term in Atlas Shrugged to describe the ideal of freedom. Patterson, over and over again in her books and her articles, she talks about how in the America that she knew when she was young, you would step off of a board sidewalk onto ground that nobody had ever walked on, right? They had this spirit of opportunity. She said once that she remembered when the Wright brothers first flew their airplane, there wasn't really a big to-do in the news about it, because at that time, everybody had assumed that, of course, you could fly, right? So that was her vision of the America of her youth. I think she'd be very disappointed by the degree to which government requires permission to engage in new enterprises. All the permit requirements, the restrictions on the ability to try something new, whether it be building permits, business licenses, restrictions by your scientific grants, the fact that so much of our university system is effectively run by the government through funding, and that requires pre-approval of whatever projects you're working on. They would say, why haven't you progressed twice as far as you have now? And their answer would be that kind of regimentation. Long-winded answer to a very complicated and fun question.
Next question down here in the front.
Thank you, Tim. That was very good presentation. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to their formal education. I mean, there was a time when women, it was hard for them to get the type of formal education that is available today to young women. And then also, it wasn't a digital world. So without being connected with so many different forms that we have today, how do these three people just happen to find contact with one another and influence one another?
So the answer to the first question is that only Rand had a formal education, really of any sort. Lane had graduated from high school, but she had no college education. And Lane had actually only graduated from high school after some delay because she traveled around with her parents on the frontier so much when she was young. Patterson had only a few years of education at all and was almost entirely self-educated. Now, as a columnist and book reviewer for the New York Herald Tribune, the leading Republican newspaper in the country, she read a lot. So she was very well educated in a huge variety of subjects, but it was almost entirely self-done. And Lane, again, it was mostly self-done. Rand was a graduate of what was then the University of Leningrad with a degree in history and a minor in philosophy. As far as how they got to know each other, so of the three, during their lifetimes, of the three, Lane was the most famous. Lane had published not only biographies of people like Herbert Hoover, but novels. Her 1935 novel, Free Land, was it 38? I'm starting to get them confused. Free Land was a huge bestseller. It was her response, by the way, the title Free Land is ironic. It's about the life on the frontier, and the point is to show that that land was not free. And it was a response to New Dealers who claimed that previous generations had had it easy because they got free land. But the 1930s, there was no free land left, and that was the cause of the Depression. And Lane was trying to show that that was nonsense. She and Patterson crossed paths because one of her books ended up on Patterson's list to review in 1925. That book, by the way, was a biography of Jack London, which Lane had written without approval and then was threatened with a lawsuit. So she changed it into a novel. And that's how it got reviewed by Isabel Paterson. And they corresponded a lot. Eventually, Lane idolized Isabel Paterson and eventually even bought a home in a nearby town in Connecticut so that they could visit frequently. Rand encountered Patterson first through her newspaper articles. And in 1940, Rand was working on the Fountainhead, and she actually quit working on the Fountainhead for a while to volunteer for the Wendell Willkie campaign, because she was convinced that if Franklin Roosevelt were elected for a third term as president, that he would become president for life. She was right. And so she volunteered to work for the Willkie campaign, and when that failed, she said that the reason it failed was because Willkie had no ideas. He didn't understand individualism. He didn't understand economics or anything. So she thought that there needed to be a group of intellectuals. There were no libertarian think tanks in that day. And the first one was founded in 1945 as Foundation for Economic Education. So there was no libertarian network at all at that time. There was nothing by Mises, nothing by Hayek. I mean, this is almost blank slate stuff. So Rand starts circulating a letter to all the intellectuals she can think of who are friendly to free markets, saying, let's get together. Patterson writes back and says, I don't ever join groups at all, but if you're ever in town, why don't you come visit? Well, Rand lived in New York, so she went down and visited Patterson at her newspaper office, and pretty soon they were staying overnight at each other's apartments and talking about ideas late into the night. And it would be really nice to have a record of those conversations, but not possible.
Thank you. I was wondering how the men of their day responded to these three women, their books, and their ideas.
Oh, yeah. How did the men of the day respond to them? So there's a story that Albert J. Nock, who was a well-known sort of libertarian conservative writer who had edited a new magazine called The Freeman, he saw their books and he said, these three women have taught us all to think. They make us men look like Confederate money. So he at least was very impressed. And there's another story that Ludwig von Mises thought Ayn Rand was a man, because the name Ayn is kind of unusual, so he just assumed that she was a man. And when she found out about it, she was delighted. Rand liked to call herself a male chauvinist pig. So she she loved the idea that men were this something above, and another editor once said that Rand wrote like a man, and Rand wrote back to her and said that in her experience, female writers tended to overemphasize personal relationships and emotions, and that she preferred to focus on reason and productivity and things, and that's why her writing that may have looked like it had a masculine tone to it. Beyond that, I don't know. I don't know that there were any male writers or thinkers at the time that looked down on them for being women, except I guess Herbert Hoover, I guess. But Sinclair Lewis was a great supporter of all three of them, really. Rand, when she read Lewis's book, she wrote him a fan letter calling him calling It Can't Happen Here the greatest novel of the 20th century. That's Lewis's dystopia about a fascist America. And she wrote him a fan letter in which she likened him to a god. And Lewis, again, he supported all their careers, and so did H.L. Mencken. Mencken tried to help Rand find a publisher for her first novel, We the Living, when all the other publishers were basically run by communists and refused to publish anything that was condemning the Soviet Union.
So I'm curious. Yeah, I'm entertained by the story of their friendship and how it sort of falls apart, and it dawns on me that this is standard libertarian. This is the standard libertarian story, right? We can't all get together and form a community that is strong enough because we're all such individualists that we're biting each other's backs and criticizing each other's interpretations of Hayek and Mises and all these things, right? So, so I was wondering, I was hoping maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit, right? I mean, is there a coherent, cohesive libertarian movement to be had when it's composed of devout individualists? And it also strikes me that this could potentially be an instance of a negative spontaneous order, right? That this is what happens when you have individualists pursuing their own interests. You end up with inability to collectivize or have any form a collective.
Well, a couple thoughts on that. The first is I remember when William F. Buckley once said of Harry Jaffa, he said, if you think it's hard to disagree with Jaffa, you just try agreeing with him. And when I asked Jaffa about this, he said, well, as Aristotle would tell you, that if you don't agree with me for the right reasons, you don't agree with me at all. And I think that is the correct answer. So the story of their falling apart is actually a lot more bland than you might expect. They did not have the kind of ideological throwdown that you often see between not just libertarians, of course, but also socialists, and every group has their ideological intellectuals who have these huge arguments about freedom or other ideas, and we profit from that. Those of us who are bystanders get to hear their disagreements and make up our own minds. That's a good thing. That's how it should be. That's not what happened with them for the most part. Patterson seems to have suffered from a great deal of depression after she lost her newspaper column in 1949. She spent the rest of her life trying to write a novel, which was never published. And she seems to, and her best friend committed suicide around the same time. So she had a lot of personal difficulties. She went out to visit Rand on the set of the Fountainhead movie and behaved so atrociously to all of Rand's friends, and including on one occasion saying something about how she didn't like Jewish intellectuals. She was not actually an anti-Semite. She was probably just trying to make some kind of a joke or something, but Rand did not like it, and because Rand herself was Jewish, and she said, so I guess I'm not an intellectual then, right? Anyway, they continued to correspond, but Rand told her, as she dropped her off at the airport, I hope you'll be happier than you are today. And Patterson appears never to have been happier. She did love the Atlas Shrugged when it was published, and she defended it against Buckley's attacks, but as far as Lane and Rand, so I mentioned they met in person only one time. It was when Rand was on a trip to do research for Atlas Shrugged, and she stopped in Connecticut, and we only have Lane's description of their conversation, and it was written about a decade later. But apparently during the conversation it turned to religion, and this was, of course, a sticking point. Rand is very unusual in the history of classical liberal thought for being an atheist believer in natural rights. Almost never do you find that. It's almost always people who believe in natural law or natural rights tie it to some supernatural source, and Rand did not. And so this set her at odds with a lot of her peers. Obviously, it left her out of the conservative movement. Buckley read her out for that reason. And so at some point in the conversation, it turned to that. Now, Lane was not a Christian. She was some sort of vague deist, and she struggled with this throughout her life. But apparently during the conversation, at what point, Lane said to Rand, well, then, what created the universe? And Rand responded, well, what created God? And that's all we know about the conversation, except that Lane said that Rand was obviously an idiot for even asking such a question. She doesn't tell us what her answer was. Interesting. But anyway, so that was the end of that, and Lane went on to say that she was the only person who really understood individualism and so forth and so on. So it wasn't really the kind of ideological threat. As far as whether there can be a libertarian community, herding cats and all that sort of thing, I don't know. What we do know is that there cannot be socialist community. We know that there cannot be collectivist community without compulsion, regimentation, and mass slaughter on an industrial scale. The collectivist societies of the world in the 20th century proved that beyond anybody's capacity to doubt. So if it is possible for people to get along and cooperate and live peacefully, they will do so on classical liberal terms. I, as a classical liberal, at least believe so. But I'm reminded of somebody once, I can't remember, I was on some radio show one time, somebody said, I said something, and the person said, well, that's just your opinion. And I said, well, whose opinion did you think I would give you?
Is there another question? Okay. I'm going to get this one here and come to you.
By the way, if you'd rather have me read the book to you, I will do so on audible.com, but you will then miss out on 100 pages of fascinating endnotes. Yeah.
I was curious, you'd mentioned the three of them and their views on race. What about, did you find much about how they viewed, say, what we'd call the indigenous people or the First Nations in Canada, and were they similar, or different, or did they even consider it very much?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'll start with Lane. Lane, of course, secretly co-authored the Little House books, and in the Little House books in recent years have come under criticism for their portrayals of Native Americans. I think really unfairly so, because the passages that have become controversial are passages in which Laura is describing her mother's fear of Indians, which was real. I mean, her mother really did live, Caroline Ingalls really did live, and she really was terrified. So it's fair for Laura to describe them that way. On one occasion, after Little House came out, the first book, maybe it was the third book. Either way, there was a passage in it where a character says something about there were no people living on the land, only Indians. And a little girl wrote a letter to Laura Ingalls Wilder and complained about this, and Wilder wrote back and said, I apologize, this was an oversight, I will have it removed immediately, and ordered her publishers to delete that phrase from future publication. So I think Wilder and Lane and her mother were quite sensitive to those kinds of concerns. Certainly very advanced for the 1950s and 40s. Patterson, she described it in her column, in her newspaper column. She talked about what it was like growing up on the Western Prairie and witnessing. She saw Indian ceremonies in real life and everything. But she wrote more about the romanticization of the Indian and American culture and literature. And she said that what do they call it? The noble savage myth had been inflicted on Indians by Europeans and then by Americans who read into Indians what they wished that they were and what they wished Europe could have been, which was this free society, and that as a result, the true civilization of native tribes had been kind of lost to history and replaced with this sort of romanticization. I'm kind of oversimplifying what her argument was. She said then that that romantic West was the Atlantis that she had known when she had grown up. She, of course, denied, for example, the common myth, still common today, that Indians didn't have property rights and all this nonsense, which is just noble savage mythology that's been imposed partly as an excuse to steal their land. Rand, on the other hand, so Rand, to my knowledge, addressed Indians only in one at one moment. That was during a question and answer session at West Point when she was delivering a talk. Afterwards, she was asked what she thought about American Indians, and her response was that they had no right to the land, no moral right to the land when Western settlers arrived because they weren't using it, and that use is what gives you a right to property, and that the Western settlers therefore had a natural right to the land that the Indians did not, and that to hold otherwise was racism. And went on to say that she said, I am prepared to believe the worst Hollywood stories about the savagery of Indians. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that Rand knew practically nothing about Indian culture. And actually, had she known more about things like Cherokee culture, she could not have substantiated such a claim, since the Cherokees were in fact a highly civilized tribe, had their own written language, their own newspapers, their own court system, and so forth as early as the 1820s and 30s. So Rand herself just was historically ignorant about that sort of thing. There is one story. When Rand first met Patterson during one of their sessions at Patterson's office in New York, they joked, Patterson and her friend, I've forgotten his last name. They teased Rand about a passage in the novel My Antonia by Willa Cather. Anybody here read Willa Cather? Have you read My Antonia? Yeah. Have you read Song of the Lark? Last year, I'm going to pause in the middle of my digression to digress again. Last year, I was encouraged to read Song of the Lark by Willa Cather and by an anonymous person on the internet who told me it's the great American novel. Well, how could I not read it after that? And this person turned out to be right. It is the great American novel. What an amazing book that is. It really is the source of so much of how we like to describe the American dream. I cannot recommend it highly enough. The Song of the Lark by Willa Cather. Anyway, so My Antonia was one of Patterson's favorite books. And there's a passage in My Antonia where these Russian brothers, I guess they're not really, they're from Eastern Europe, are on this, it's a bizarre passage where they're on this sled being on their way to a wedding party, and they're being chased by wolves, and they escape the wolves by throwing all the guests of the wedding party out of the sleigh, and they're eaten by wolves, and the brother survives, and this haunts him for the rest of his life. It's such a bizarre story. But anyway, so they teased Rand about that at this meeting, and they said, did you ever know any Russian sleds to be chased by wolves? And did you why didn't you just bring along friends on trips like that so that you could toss them to the wolves on your way? And Rand responded that she had never known any actual Russian sled to be pursued by any actual wolves in her childhood, but that as a Russian girl in her school, she learned all about the Indians tomahawking settlers in America. To which Patterson responded that having grown up among the Indians, she had never encountered anybody being tomahawked or anything like that. So, but that's basically everything I know about Indians and the Three Furies. I should probably clarify that for those who don't know, the reason I chose Furies as the title is that William F. Buckley once referred to these three women as the Three Furies of modern libertarianism, which I sort of suspect he kind of did not mean in a complimentary way, but which turns out to be actually apt in some ways that you will discover when you read my book. Yes?
Tim, thanks a lot. So you label yourself a classical liberal. You're standing in front of a podium promoting economic liberty, right? And so given the rise now of homeland economics, subsidies, protectionism, interventionism, how can we make Randian belief in free markets popular again? How can we persuade our friends and neighbors that true, individual economic liberty is worth pursuing rather than the government determining, where resources ought to be allocated?
Well, I'll give you Rand's answer because I don't know. Well, I'll give you Lane's answer first. Lane's answer was it has to start in the classroom and it has to start in the early classroom. Lane spent the last years of her life mainly as an activist on the question of curriculum in public schools. So much so, I didn't even tell the story about how the FBI surveilled her and monitored her mail. But anyway, so much so that it got her a write-up by a secret agent from the FBI who attended one of her talks and said that she was telling people subversive things. And this was referred to Attorney General Tom Clark. Anyway, it's all in the book. So Lane would have said it has to start with the kids and it has to start with getting people to love their freedom. You can't have freedom in a society among people who don't care about and appreciate and love just the very feeling of their freedom. And of course, that's why the Little House on the Prairie novels, even though Lane never put her name on them, is really her greatest legacy and the thing that has had the biggest impact on American culture of all of the three Furies. Even Rand, as influential as she has been within the libertarian community, has not come a fraction as influential as Lane has been through the Little House television series and books. As for Rand wrote an entire essay called "What Can One Person Do?" And her answer was speak out. Her answer was pronounce judgment and express yourself. And she said, nobody expects you to change the world by yourself, and it would be foolish and indeed immoral, in Rand's view, to try. You should go about living your life for the pursuit of your own happiness. But, as what my advice to people is, take just a little bit of time out of your day to do something for freedom. That's all it takes, just something. You never know what it might be. I'll digress to talk about my mother a little bit. In fact, this is fitting because my mother inspired me to learn about Rose Wilder Lane, because she was a Little House fan when she was little, and she taught me this. Well, my mother, when I was in high school, she worked for a fabric store in our town. She was, she sews and things, so she knew all about fabric, so she got this job working in this fabric store. When she was at the cash register, whenever anybody would buy something, my mother would hand the person the receipt and say, all right, that's $12 for the fabric and $3.15 in taxes. And she was always proud to report to me how many people that day said to her, wow, that's a lot, isn't it? Right? It's every little bit helps. Right? And honestly, there are a lot of reasons to be pessimistic in today's world. But there are also an awful lot of reasons to be optimistic. One of those reasons being that we have the work that was done for us by people like Lane Patterson and Rand and Mises and Hayek and all these other thinkers that they didn't have. They didn't have the theory of spontaneous order. They didn't have an explanation of why the price mechanism makes socialism physically impossible to accomplish. They didn't have that scholarship. That's been done for us. So we have tremendous advantages if we will use it and not succumb to the foolish ideas of our own enemies, which is our biggest problem today.
I think that's an appropriate point at which to stop. We would like to thank the speaker, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.